The sound was singular and final, a heavy silver lid dropping against a ceramic rim. It sliced through the humid afternoon air of the Oakhaven Vicarage garden, cutting momentarily through the low hum of polite conversation and the distant rhythmic thwack of the croquet mallet on the lower lawn. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a wicker chair that had seen better decades, did not look up immediately. She merely paused in her knitting. Purl too, knit too. The rhythm of her needles was a comfort, a small orderly ticking against the chaotic heat of the day. The air inside the marquee was stifling, a thick soup of scents that seemed to have been boiled together in a pot too small to contain them. There was the overwhelming, cloying sweetness of Mrs. Bantry's phlox arrangements.
It turns the sponge
The
bits
sharp,
into damp
dusty
flannels.
smell of dry grass being trampled by sensible shoes. And cutting through it all, the heavy, righteous
really does.
odour of
Men
beeswax
often
from the
mistake
church hall
their
chairs
appetites for
that had been
administrative
dragged out onto the lawn for the occasion. To her left, Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy was fanning herself with a programme. "It's the humidity, Jane," she announced, as if the weather were a personal affront she intended to take up with the committee. "It turns the sponge cakes into damp flannels. I told the vicar, I said, 'Vicar, if you insist on July, you must expect the cakes to weep.' He didn't listen. He rarely does when it concerns the bake sale, Elspeth," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes finally lifting to scan the tent.
Strutting about
Men
like he owns
often
the
mistake
very
their
air we
appetites for administrative wisdom. The scene before them was a tableau of English village life, suspended in the amber of a hot summer afternoon. The tea tent was the heart of the fete, a canvas cathedral dedicated to the worship of the Darjeeling leaf and the cucumber sandwich. But the atmosphere was not entirely benign. Miss Marple, whose nose was as attuned to social friction as it was to the scent of burning toast, detected a certain tightness in the air. It wasn't just the heat. It was a tension, taut as a violin string waiting to snap. Her gaze drifted to the centre table, the silver platter. It was Mrs. McGillicuddy's pride and joy, a massive, ornate thing polished to a mirror shine, currently hosting the remnants of the Special Reserve cream scones. Only 3 remained. They sat there, golden brown and studded with raisins, like 3 small edible monarchs on a silver throne. They smelled divine, a rich, buttery aroma that wafted across the tent, overpowering even the strong scent of the Major's pipe tobacco. "Look at him," Mrs. McGillicuddy hissed, leaning in. Her stays creaked. "Strutting about like he owns the very air we breathe. If he knocks over the urn, I shall not be responsible for my actions." She was referring, of course, to Mr. Rupert Blackwood. Rupert Blackwood did not walk. He occupied space aggressively. He was a large man, encased in a checked suit that was far too loud for a church fete, the fabric straining across his broad back. He moved through the crowd not with grace, but with the unstoppable force of a rolling pin flattening a piece of unwilling dough. He was sweating profusely, and a wave of his personal scent preceded him. A pungent cocktail of expensive, oily hair tonic and the stale, bitter smoke of Havana cigars. It was an intrusive smell, one that barged into one's nose without knocking. He was currently cornering Clara Goody near the jam preserve stand. The perspective shifted, drifting across the tent to where Clara stood, her back pressed against the trestle table. Clara Goody, the village librarian, felt very much like a book that had been shelved in the wrong section, small, dusty, and desperate to be overlooked. She clutched her handbag with white-knuckled ferocity. The smell of Rupert's cigar smoke was making her eyes water, Or perhaps it was the tears of frustration she was holding back. "It's a simple business proposition, Miss Goody," Rupert boomed. His voice was a blunt instrument. "The library is a rotting pile of timber, a fire hazard. I'm doing the village a favour. Condos, Miss Goody, modern living. That's what Oakhaven needs, not dusty volumes of poetry that nobody reads." "People do read them," Clara squeaked. Her voice was thin, like a flute played by a child with insufficient breath. "The Major was in just yesterday for a history of the regiment, and Mrs. Bantry likes the mysteries." Rupert laughed. It was a wet, hacking sound. "The Major! That old fossil! He's living in the past, just like you. I've spoken to the council. The demolition order is as good as signed. You best start packing your bags, or whatever it is you spinster types do." He leaned closer. The smell of him, sweat and arrogance, was suffocating. "You're a rude man, Mr. Blackwood," Clara whispered, her courage flaring up like a match struck in a draught, only to be instantly extinguished. "A very rude man. And you," Rupert sneered, "are in the way." Turned on his heel, the heavy rubber soles of his shoes squeaking against the grass, and marched towards the tea-table. Clara let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since Tuesday. She looked down at her shoes. They were sensible, brown lace-ups. Sensible! That was her word. She was sensible Clara, who would never make a scene, never raise her voice, and who would quietly watch her beloved library be turned into a block of flats because she lacked the spine to stop it. Or did she? Her eyes darted to her handbag. It was heavy. There was a tin inside. Rat poison. For the library basement, she had told the hardware store clerk. Rats. 2:15 p.m. Major Hastings, retired, stood by the tent entrance, his posture as rigid as a garden rake. He was watching Rupert Blackwood's retreat from the librarian with eyes that were cold, hard chips of flint. The Major was a man of rituals. He believed in the sanctity of the queue, the precision of a well-tied tie, and the absolute moral necessity of afternoon tea served at the correct temperature. He wore a tweed jacket despite the sweltering heat, for to remove one's jacket in the presence of ladies was, in his mind, the first step toward anarchy. He smelled of old leather, pipe ash, and a faint, sharp underlying note of surgical spirit. He rubbed it on his joints for the rheumatism. He watched Rupert approach the main table. "Cad," the Major muttered under his breath. The word tasted of iron. He too had a stake in the day's events, but his focus was narrower. He was guarding the scones. It was a peculiar duty he had assigned himself. The Major had been standing within 5 feet of the silver platter for the last hour, ostensibly chatting with the vicar, but in reality acting as a sentinel. He knew the etiquette. One did not take the last scone. It was the unwritten constitution of the village tea. One could take the second to last, provided one offered it to one's neighbour first, but the last scone, that was to be left. It was a symbol of plenty, a gesture that said, "We are not savages, we do not scrape the plate clean." There were 3 left now. A small boy in short trousers approached the table, his eyes fixed on the platter. The Major cleared his throat. It was a terrifying sound, like a gearbox grinding without a clutch. "Careful, lad," the Major barked, though his voice was low. "Those are Mrs. McGillicuddy's prize winners. Heavy on the stomach. Better stick to a biscuit." The boy, sensing the steel behind the words, veered away toward the sponge cake. The Major nodded to himself. The perimeter was secure, but then the perimeter was breached. Rupert Blackwood arrived at the table. He did not wait in line. He did not nod to the ladies pouring the tea. He simply barged into the gap between the Major and the table, his checked suit filling the visual field like a migraine. "Thirsty work, talking sense to idiots," Rupert announced to no one in particular. He grabbed a cup, slopping tea into the saucer. "What's this? Scones? About time." He reached out a hand, a thick, hairy hand with manicured nails that looked incongruous, like velvet curtains on a pigsty, and took one of the 3 scones. 2 left. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, felt her knitting needles pause again. She saw the Major's jaw tighten. A muscle jumped in his cheek, a small rhythmic spasm. "Mr. Blackwood," the Major said. His voice was dangerously quiet. "There is a queue." Rupert turned, chewing with his mouth open. Crumbs sprayed onto his lapel. "Queue? I paid my entrance fee, didn't I? Same as you, Hastings, though I suppose you're on the pensioner's rate." The insult hung in the air, suspended in the humidity. The Major's face went a dark brick red. He said nothing. He simply stepped back, his heels sinking slightly into the soft turf. It was a retreat. Or was it? Miss Marple tilted her head. To the casual observer, the Major had been cowed. But Miss Marple had watched cats in the Hugh village for too many years to mistake a retreat for a pounce. The Major hadn't stepped back in fear. He had stepped back to clear the field of fire. Rupert finished the first scone in 2 bites. He reached for the second. 1 left. The tension in the tent ratcheted up a notch. Conversations faltered. Eyes began to swivel toward the table. It was a macabre fascination. Would he do it? Would he take the last one? 2:25 p.m. The atmosphere was now thick enough to slice. The scent of the scones seemed to intensify, the rich aroma of baking powder and raisins battling with Rupert's cigar smoke. Sylvia Blackwood entered the tent. She was a ghost of a woman, pale and thin, dressed in a silk frock that must have cost more than the vicar's annual stipend, yet she wore it as if it were a shroud. Her eyes were pale blue, washed out as if she had cried the colour right out of them over the years. She smelled of violets, a sad, fading perfume that lingered like a memory. She saw her husband at the table. She saw the crumbs on his chin. She saw the way the village looked at him, with loathing, with fear, with disgust. And for a fleeting second, a look crossed her face that Miss Marple knew well. It was the look a housewife gives a stain on a tablecloth that simply will not wash out. A look of calculation. "Rupert," she said, her voice was brittle. "We should go. The car is hot." "Quiet, woman," Rupert grunted. He was eyeing the final scone. "I'm having my tea." "Please," Sylvia whispered. She touched his arm. He shook her off, a violent, jerky motion that made her stumble. "I said quiet," he roared. The tent went silent, totally, utterly silent. The only sound was the buzzing of a fat bluebottle fly circling the jam pot. Rupert looked around, his face flushed with heat and triumph. He enjoyed the silence. He mistook their shock for respect. He looked at the Major. He looked at Clara, shivering by the entrance. He looked at his wife, cowering by his side. "You lot," he sneered. "No backbone, none of you." He turned back to the platter, the silver platter. The last scone sat there, lonely and perfect. It was slightly larger than the others, with a generous dollop of cream already resting on the side, inviting, tempting. Miss Marple dropped a stitch. She saw the Major's eyes. They were fixed on that scone with an intensity that was almost religious. He wasn't looking at Rupert. He was looking at the pastry. Why, she wondered. Why is the scone more interesting than the man? And then she smelled it. Just a waft. a tiny fleeting scent that drifted past her nose as a breeze ruffled the tent flaps. Underneath the tobacco, underneath the beeswax, underneath the phlox, bitter almonds. It was faint, masked by the sweetness of the strawberry jam, but it was there, like a wrong note in a familiar hymn. Rupert's hand hovered over the plate. "Well," he said, his voice booming in the quiet, "waste not, want not." He reached for the last scone. 2:45 p.m. The silence in the tent wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressed down by the humidity and the collective breath of 23 people watching a breach of social contract. Rupert Blackwood held the scone. It was a magnificent specimen of baking, golden and craggy, the raisin's dark little eyes staring back at him. He didn't just hold it, he brandished it, a weapon of indifference against a village that prized manners above all else. "Well?" he challenged the room, his voice booming too loud, bouncing off the canvas roof. "Anyone else want to stake a claim? No? Speak now or forever. Hold your peace, as the vicar says." Nobody spoke. The vicar, standing near the entrance with a plate of untouched cucumber sandwiches, looked as though he wanted to intervene but couldn't quite remember the prayer for prevention of gluttony. Rupert grinned. It was not a nice smile. It showed too many teeth and not enough warmth. He raised the scone to his mouth. He took a bite, a large one. Miss Marple watched his throat work. She saw the muscles strain as he swallowed, a mechanical action that seemed devoid of pleasure, purely functional. He was consuming the scone not because he was hungry, but because it was there, and because nobody else could have it. "Dry," Rupert announced, spraying crumbs. He reached for the clotted cream, bypassing the spoon entirely and using his own knife, which he had just licked. A collective shudder went through the ladies' committee. He slathered the cream on the remaining half, then dipped the knife deep into the strawberry jam, swirling it around, contaminating the pristine red jar with streaks of white cream. He shoved the rest of the scone into his mouth. It happened in the space of a heartbeat. One moment he was chewing, his face flushed with the heat and the triumph of his petty victory. The next, the chewing stopped. Rupert's eyes, already bulging slightly from his earlier exertions, went wide, staring, fixed on something that wasn't there. He dropped, his teacup. Smash! The sound was shockingly loud. Shards of Mrs. McGillicuddy's second-best china skittered across the grass, brown liquid splashing onto the hem of Sylvia Blackwood's dress. Sylvia didn't move. She just stared at the stain, her pale blue eyes completely blank, as if she were trying to calculate the cost of the dry cleaning. Rupert made a noise. A wet guttural gag. He clawed at his throat. His face, previously a ruddy red, began to darken, turning a terrifying shade of plum. "He's choking!" someone cried out, perhaps the vicar's wife. "Slap his back!" another voice suggested, though nobody moved to do it. Rupert staggered. He was a big man, heavy and flailing, and his movements were clumsy, panicked. He lurched backward, away from the table, away from the staring eyes. He crashed into the trestle table, sending the milk jug spinning. The Major watched. He stood absolutely still, his hands clasped behind his back in a parade rest stance. He did not step forward to help. He did not shout for a doctor. He simply watched, his face a mask of polite interest, as if observing a cricket match that had taken a slightly unexpected turn. Rupert fell. He didn't crumple gracefully like they did in the moving pictures. He went down hard, a dead weight, crashing backward into Mrs. Bantry's prize hydrangeas. The bushes groaned under his bulk, snapping and rustling. He thrashed once, his heels drumming a frantic staccato rhythm on the dry grass. Then he arched his back, a terrible straining convulsion that seemed to try and expel the very soul from his body. And then nothing. The drumming stopped. The thrashing ceased. Rupert Blackwood lay amongst the crushed blue flowers, his eyes open, staring up at the canvas roof of the tent, seeing nothing. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. That had been the silence of embarrassment. This was the silence of finality. It was broken by a smell. Miss Marple smelled it first. It drifted toward her, riding the hot air currents of the afternoon. It was sharp, pungent. It cut through the cloying scent of the crushed hydrangeas and the spilled tea. It was a smell that didn't belong in a garden fête. Bitter almonds. It wasn't the jam. It wasn't the scone. It was the scent of death, ancient and chemical. Don't touch him. The command came from the entrance. Dr. Haydock pushed his way through the crowd, his face grim. He knelt beside the body, feeling for a pulse that everyone knew wasn't there. He sniffed the air near Rupert's open mouth, then recoiled, his nose wrinkling. He looked up, his eyes meeting the Major's. "He's gone," Haydock said flatly, "and I wouldn't recommend anyone else eat the scones." 3 p.m. chaos, when it comes to the English, is a quiet affair. There was no screaming, really. Just a lot of gasping and the hurried ushering of children out of the tent. "Come along, Timothy. Don't look at the nasty man." "Is he asleep, Mummy?" "Yes, dear. Very asleep." The tent emptied rapidly, leaving only a core group of people who seemed anchored to the tragedy by invisible weights. The body remained in the hydrangeas, covered now by a tablecloth that Mrs. McGillicuddy had sacrificed with a heavy sigh. Inspector Craddock had been called. The village constable, P.C. Pork, was currently standing guard by the white wicket gate, looking important and slightly sick. Miss Marple had not moved. She sat in her wicker chair, her knitting resting in her lap. She was studying the table. The silver platter was empty, just crumbs. That was all that was left of the weapon. A few golden crumbs and a smear of jam. She looked at the Major. He had moved now, taking a seat on a folding chair near the entrance. He looked tired. The stiffness had gone out of his shoulders. He was rubbing his left knee, the one with the rheumatism. "A bad business," the Major said. He wasn't speaking to anyone, really. Just to the air. "A very bad business, but the man had no manners, none at all. Is that why he's dead?" Miss Marple asked softly. Her voice was gentle, like a grandmother asking a child about a scraped knee. "Because of his manners?" The Major looked at her. His eyes were hard again. "He took what wasn't his, Jane. That's all I'm saying. He took the last one. Greedy." Miss Marple nodded, as if this made perfect sense. She turned her gaze to Clara Goody. The librarian was weeping. Not loudly, but with a steady, leaking despair. She was clutching her handbag so tightly the leather was creasing. She stood near the jam stand, as far from the body as she could get without leaving the tent. "I didn't mean," Clara stammered. "I mean, I hated him. I did. God forgive me, I hated him, but I didn't want this." "Of course you didn't, dear," Miss Marple soothed, though her eyes were sharp, watching Clara's hands. "Nobody wants a death at the fête. It ruins the atmosphere entirely." And then there was Sylvia. Sylvia Blackwood was the only one who had moved closer to the body, not away from it. She stood over the covered mound that had been her husband. She wasn't crying. Her face was dry, composed, almost serene. The tension that had been in her jaw earlier, the housewife's calculation, was gone. She looked relieved. "I suppose," Sylvia said, her voice clear and devoid of tremor, "that I shall have to cancel the car." "The car, Mrs. Blackwood?" Dr. Haydock asked, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "The taxi," she corrected herself, though Miss Marple noted the slip. "I had ordered a taxi to take us home. Rupert hated driving in this heat." She looked up, and for a moment the light caught her eyes. They were pale blue, watery and indistinct against the stark white of her face. They held no secrets, or perhaps they held all of them. "He was a difficult man," Sylvia said, "but he enjoyed his food. At least he died doing what he loved, taking things." Miss Marple frowned. A small vertical line appeared between her eyebrows. Something was wrong. Not with the murder. That was clearly a poisoning, bold and nasty. But with the picture, the composition was off. She looked back at the empty silver platter. If the poison was in the scone, it was a gamble. A terrible, reckless gamble. How could the killer know Rupert would eat it? Anyone could have taken it. The vicar, the little boy in short trousers, even the major, unless... Miss Marple's mind went back to the village of St. Mary Mead, to a cat named Tibbles, who would only eat fish from a specific blue saucer. Unless the trap wasn't the food, unless the trap was the plate. The smell of bitter almonds was fading now, replaced by the heavier, earthier scent of the crushed hydrangeas and the lingering stale tobacco smoke that seemed to cling to the air where Rupert had stood. The heat was oppressive. A storm was coming. Miss Marple could feel it in her own joints. A dull ache that mirrored the throb of the tension in the tent. "Think," Miss Marple said, packing her knitting away into her large tapestry bag, "that we should all wait for the inspector. And perhaps someone should cover the jam. The flies are becoming quite a nuisance." 3:15 p.m. Inspector Dermot Craddock was a man who preferred his murders indoors, preferably in libraries with clear lines of sight and a decanter of sherry within arm's reach. A village fête in the middle of a heatwave was, in his professional opinion, a chaotic nightmare. The vicarage garden had taken on a surreal quality. The brightly coloured bunting, limp now in the stifling air, looked festive only in the way a clown's smile looks festive at a funeral. The body of Rupert Blackwood had been removed, leaving behind only flattened hydrangeas and a lingering, metallic scent of violence that hung low over the grass, mixing unpleasantly with the smell of warm lemonade. Craddock stood by the tea-tent entrance, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that was already surrendering to the humidity. "So," he said, his voice tight, "let me get this straight. He ate a scone. He died." "Precisely, Inspector," Miss Marple said. She was seated again, having moved her chair slightly to avoid the sun. She looked remarkably cool, a small island of beige serenity in a sea of perspiring panic. And he was the only one who ate from that particular batch at that particular time. Craddock sighed. He looked at the empty silver platter. It had been dusted for fingerprints, a process that had left a fine layer of grey powder over Mrs. McGillicuddy's family heirloom, much to her vocal distress. "It looks like a random attack, Aunt Jane," Craddock muttered, lowering his voice. "Cyanide in the dough? A maniac? Someone with a grudge against the Fate Committee? Or perhaps against the vicar?" "Oh, I hardly think so, dear," Miss Marple corrected him gently. "If one wished to kill the vicar, one would poison the cucumber sandwiches. He is partial to them. No, this was quite specific, like choosing the right wool for a sock. You don't pick the coarse grey for a baby's booty." Craddock blinked. He was used to her domestic analogies, but they still had a way of cutting through his police procedure like a pair of sharp embroidery scissors. Specific? It was a communal plate. Anyone could have taken that scone. Could they? Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the Major, who was currently barking at PC Pork about the proper way to cordon off a crime scene. I wonder. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. The scent of lavender water rose from her lace collar, combating the heavy medicinal smell of the police photographer's flashbulbs. Observe the Major, Dermot. Look at his shoes. Craddock looked. Major Hastings was wearing a pair of brogues that were ancient but cared for with an obsessive devotion. They gleamed with a deep dark lustre that spoke of hours of labour. What about them? The Polish, Miss Marple murmured. Do you smell it? Even from Here, high-grade beeswax and turpentine. A man who takes that much care with his leather, who polishes the very instep, is a man of rigid habits, a man of lines and boundaries. He would never step out of line, unless he intended to. Craddock frowned. He stepped out of line. He stepped aside, Miss Marple corrected. He was guarding that plate like a terrier. Yet when Mr. Blackwood arrived, a man he loathed, he simply made way. It was most uncharacteristic, like a door being opened to a draught. 3:30 p.m. The interrogation of Clara Goody took place in the vicar's study, a room that smelled of old leather bindings and dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Clara sat on the edge of the sofa, her knees pressed together so tightly they must have bruised. She looked smaller than ever, a sparrow caught in a gust of wind. Her handbag was on her lap, shielded by her arms. I didn't do it, she whispered. Her voice was a dry rustle. I just wanted him to stop shouting. Miss Goody, Craddock said, trying to soften his voice, but failing to hide the exhaustion. We found the tin in your bag. Rat be gone. The active ingredient is arsenic, not cyanide, but it shows intent. Clara flinched. Tears leaked from her eyes, tracking through the face powder she had applied in a vain attempt to hide her blotchy skin. It was for the basement, she wailed, the sound shocking in the quiet room. The rats! They're eating the encyclopedias. Volume A to C is ruined. I bought it this morning at the hardware store. You can ask Mr. Higgins. We will, Craddock said, but you were seen arguing with the deceased moments before he died. He threatened you. He threatened the library, Clara corrected, a sudden flash of steel in her voice. It was the defensive tone of a mother protecting a child. He was going to tear it down. He called it a rotting pile. He didn't care about the history. He didn't care about the people. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. I hated him, she admitted. I wished him dead. I prayed for it, actually, during the morning service. Let him be removed, I said, but I didn't think God would use a scone. Craddock scribbled in his notebook. Motive, strong. Means, questionable. Opportunity, high. Did you go near the tea tent, Miss Goody, before he ate? I walked past, she stammered, to get some lemonade. The Major was there. He glared at me. He always glares if you get too close to the food before the official opening. He's very particular. Particular, Craddock repeated. He looked out the window. The Major was still outside, pacing the perimeter of the lawn. He walked with a rhythmic, measured gait. Left, right, turn, like a sentry. 3:45 p.m. Miss Marple had tired of the tent. She made her way slowly toward the white wicket gate, nodding to the villagers who were huddled in small, gossiping clusters. The shock was wearing off, replaced by the thrill of scandal. They say it was the wife. No, it was the librarian poisoned the jam. Rubbish. It was the heat. Heart attack. Miss Marple listened. She collected these fragments of dialogue like dropped stitches, knitting them into the pattern in her mind. She stopped by the Major, who was now leaning on his cane near the hydrangeas. "A terrible tragedy, Major," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were clear, blue and utterly remorseless. "Tragedy, perhaps, or perhaps a sanitation service." He tapped his cane on the ground. Thud. "The man was a blight, Jane. A weed. Weeds must be pulled." "But to do it here," Miss Marple said softly. "At the fête. It seems so public." "Public?" The Major snorted. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his brow. The scent of beeswax drifted from him again, not just from his shoes this time, but from the walking stick itself, which he clearly polished with the same obsessive devotion. "Justice should be public, shouldn't it? A court-martial is public. A hanging is public. Why should a reckoning be hidden in the dark?" He looked at the empty space where the body had been. "He took the last one, Jane. He knew the rules. He knew the code. He ignored it. He thought he was above the law of the village." "And the punishment for bad manners is death?" Miss Marple asked. The Major smiled. It was a cold, thin expression. "In some regiments, Jane, the punishment for looting the mess hall is very severe indeed." He turned and walked away, his cane clicking on the path. Click, click, click. A steady, military beat. Miss Marple watched him go. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The Major hadn't denied it, not really. He had justified it, but justification was not a confession, and the police needed proof, not philosophy. 4 p.m. Inspector Craddock found Sylvia Blackwood sitting in the back of the police car, the door open to allow a breeze that didn't exist. She was smoking a cigarette, a long, slender thing held in trembling fingers. Her other hand was resting on a leather suitcase that sat on the seat beside her. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Blackwood?" Craddock asked, nodding at the bag. Sylvia exhaled a plume of blue smoke, her eyes pale and watery, fixed on the middle distance. "I was leaving him," she said simply. "Tonight. I'd packed while he was shouting at the gardener this morning. I had a taxi booked for 3 o'clock. I was going to take the train to London." "Convenient," Craddock said. "Now you're a widow. You inherit everything, and you don't have to run away." "I wasn't running," Sylvia said. Her voice was flat, tired. "I was escaping. There is a difference." She looked at the suitcase. It was old leather, battered but expensive. "I polished the floors this morning," she said suddenly. A non sequitur that made Craddock blink. "The whole hallway, on my hands and knees. It smelled of lavender and—" She trailed off. "I wanted the house to be perfect when I left. I wanted him to see what he was losing. I wanted the wood to shine so brightly it hurt his eyes." She looked at Craddock. "I didn't kill him, Inspector. I didn't need to. I was already free. In my head, I was already gone." Craddock looked at her. She seemed fragile, like fine china that had been chipped. But chips could be sharp. "Did you touch the scones, Mrs. Blackwood?" "No," she said. "I hate raisins. Rupert loved them. He loved anything that was sweet and heavy and mine." She stubbed out the cigarette. "He took everything, Inspector, my money, my confidence, my youth, taking the last scone. That was just habit." Craddock stepped back from the car. He had 3 suspects. The librarian with the rat poison, the wife with the packed bag and the inheritance, and the Major with the fanatical code of honor. But who had the opportunity? The scone had been on the plate for 20 minutes before Rupert arrived. Anyone could have touched it. But only one person had stood guard over it. Craddock looked across the lawn. Miss Marple was waving at him. It was a small, fluttery wave, the kind a grandmother gives when the tea is ready. But Craddock knew better. That wave meant she had found something. He walked toward her. She was standing by the refuse bin, near the catering tent. She was holding something up with the end of a knitting needle. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Wax paper. "Look, Dermot," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "I found this near the hydrangea bush, just where the Major was standing before he moved to the entrance." Craddock leaned in. The paper was translucent, coated in a fine white dust. "Is that sugar?" Miss Marple suggested. "Or perhaps—" She leaned closer, sniffing. "No," she said, "not sugar, and it doesn't smell of flour." She looked up at him. "It smells," she said, "of almonds." 4:30 p.m. The sky above Oakhaven had turned the colour of a bruised plum. The heat, previously a solid weight, had now curdled into a sticky, electric tension. A storm was coming. You could smell it. Ozone and damp earth mixing with the lingering, sickly scent of the crushed hydrangeas. Inspector Craddock held the wax paper with a pair of tweezers. He looked at it with the skepticism of a man who wanted a smoking gun, not a piece of litter. "It's a wrapper, Aunt Jane," he said, squinting against the darkening light. "From a sweet? A cough drop, perhaps?" "Oh, I think not, dear," Miss Marple said. A small, delighted smile played on her lips. She wasn't horrified. She wasn't sad. She looked, if anything, thoroughly entertained. It was the look she wore when she finally unravelled a particularly knotty piece of knitting. "Look at the fold. Precise, military. And the dust inside. That isn't sugar." She chuckled softly. "It's really quite clever. Wicked, of course, but clever." Craddock stared at her. "You find murder amusing?" "Not the murder, Dermot. The architecture of it. It's a puzzle, you see. And this one has been constructed with such a specific understanding of human nature." She tapped her nose. "The killer didn't just know poison. They knew people. Specifically, they knew Oakhaven." She turned away from the bin, her eyes scanning the thinning crowd. "I need to speak to Miss Goody again. Just one question. A silly one, really." Clara Goody was sitting on a bench near the exit, her face pale. She was shredding a paper napkin into tiny, snowy confetti. Miss Marple approached her. The older woman's movement was deceptive. She looked frail, a drift of beige wool and lace, but her arrival at the bench was sudden. "Miss Goody," Miss Marple chirped. "A quick word." Clara jumped. "Oh, Miss Marple, have they found something?" "Several things," Miss Marple said comfortably, sitting down. "But I was wondering about the scone, the last one." Clara flinched. "I told the inspector. I didn't touch it." No, I know you didn't. But you wanted to, didn't you? You were hungry. You skipped lunch to set up the book. Stall. Yes, Clara admitted, her voice small. I was famished." "So why didn't you take it?" Miss Marple asked. Her blue eyes were twinkling. "It was there. Nobody was claiming it. Why did you leave it on the plate?" Clara looked at her as if she were mad. "Because it was the last one," she said, as if explaining gravity to a toddler. "One doesn't take the last one. It's not done. What would people think, that I was greedy, that I had no self-control?" "Exactly," Miss Marple beamed. "Social pressure. Heavier than a lead weight." She patted Clara's hand. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful. You've confirmed the mechanism of the trap." Miss Marple stood up, smoothing her skirt. The wind was picking up now, rustling the leaves of the oak trees. She looked toward the police car, where Sylvia Blackwood was still waiting. The window was down. Sylvia was staring at the Major, who was now engaged in a heated debate with the vicar about the morality of gambling at a church function. Sylvia turned her head. Her eyes met Miss Marple's. They were steely grey, hard, flinty eyes that held no warmth, no water, just the cold resolve of a woman who had packed her life into a suitcase. They were the colour of the storm clouds gathering overhead. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured to herself. Very interesting. She walked back to Craddock. The first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Heavy, fat drops that hissed as they hit the hot pavement. "Dermot," she said, "I believe I know how it was done, and why." "Go on," Craddock said, sheltering his notebook. "It wasn't the scone itself," Miss Marple explained, her voice light, almost singing. "If you or I had eaten it, we would be fine. Well, perhaps a bit of indigestion from the richness, but alive. But the poison was topological," Miss Marple said, enjoying the word. "It was on the top, dusted, like sugar, but only on that specific scone. The killer had to be sure, absolutely certain, that Rupert Blackwood, and only Rupert Blackwood, would eat it." "But that's impossible," Craddock argued. "It was a public plate. Anyone could have walked up." "Anyone could have," Miss Marple agreed. "But nobody would have, except him." She gestured around the garden. "Look at them, Dermot. The Major, Clara, the vicar, Mrs. McGillicuddy. They are all bound by invisible ropes, manners, etiquette, the fear of being thought rude, the fear of taking the last piece. It's a powerful force in a village, stronger than hunger." She chuckled again. The killer knew that Rupert was the only person here arrogant enough, selfish enough, and boorish enough to ignore the rule, to break the taboo. The trap wasn't hidden in the food. The trap was hidden in his own character. "So," Craddock said slowly, "if Rupert hadn't taken it, nobody would have died," Miss Marple finished. "The scone would have been thrown away at the end of the day. A failed murder. But the killer knew his victim. He knew Rupert couldn't resist. It was a psychological certainty. And the wax paper? The delivery system," Miss Marple said. "Carried in a pocket, unfolded discreetly. The powder dusted onto the scone while pretending to arrange the plate. Or perhaps she looked at the Major. He was standing by the gate now, watching the rain. He looked almost peaceful. "Perhaps while guarding it," she whispered. Lightning flashed. A brilliant, jagged fork that illuminated the garden in stark white relief. Thunder followed instantly, a crack that shook the ground. "Major Hastings," Miss Marple said. "He stepped aside. Do you remember? He made a path for Rupert. He invited him in." "He hated him," Craddock said. "Yes, but he is also a man of honour," Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested that honour was a flexible concept. "He wouldn't kill an innocent. He wouldn't risk Clara or the vicar. He set a trap that only a cad would trigger. If Rupert had shown even a shred of decency, if he had offered the scone to someone else, or left it alone, he would be alive." She shook her head, smiling ruefully. "It's almost biblical, isn't it? His own greed was the executioner." The rain began to fall in earnest now, a torrential downpour that sent the remaining guests scurrying for the shelter of the marquee. "Bring them in, Dermot," Miss Marple said, unfurling her umbrella. "The tea party is over. It's time for the washing up." 5 p.m. The rain hammered against the canvas roof of the marquee, a relentless drumming roar that made conversation difficult. Inside, the air was damp and cooling rapidly. The heat of the day washed away by the storm. The smell of wet grass and sodden wool coats replaced the earlier sense of flowers and fear. They were gathered near the tea urns, a small, damp congregation. Inspector Craddock stood with his back to the tent flap, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Miss Marple sat on a folding chair, her hands resting quietly on her bag. The Major, Clara, and Sylvia stood in a loose semicircle, like actors waiting for their final cues. "It wasn't a random poisoning," Craddock began, his voice raised to be heard over the thunder. "And it wasn't meant for just anyone." He looked at the Major. "Major Hastings," Craddock said formally, "you were the only one who stood by that plate for the 20 minutes prior to Mr. Blackwood's arrival. You were guarding it." The Major didn't flinch. He stood at attention, his spine as straight as a ramrod. He looked tired, yes, but not afraid. "I was ensuring order," the Major said. His voice was calm, almost bored. "You were ensuring the trap was set," Miss Marple corrected him gently. She looked up at him, her eyes soft but unyielding. "You knew, didn't you? You knew that nobody in Oakhaven, not the vicar, not Clara, not even a hungry child, would take the last scone. It is simply not done. It is a breach of the social contract." She paused, listening to the highs, rain. "But you also knew Rupert Blackwood. You knew his greed. You knew his arrogance. You knew that if he saw something he wanted, and nobody else had claimed it, he would take it. He couldn't help himself. It was his nature." The Major smiled. It was a genuine smile this time, touched with a strange sort of pride. "He was a predator, Jane, a fox in the henhouse. He took the library fund. He took Mrs. Bantry's land for that bypass. He took my—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "He took my dignity, years ago. A bad investment, he called it. Swindled, I call it." "So you dusted the Scone," Craddock said, "with the cyanide you kept for your butterfly collection?" "Cyanide jars," the Major corrected. "For the killing jar. Yes, I had it in a wax paper packet in my pocket. While I was pretending to shoo away the flies, I simply dusted the top, just a sprinkle, like sugar." He looked at the empty silver platter. "I gave him a choice, Inspector. That's the irony. If he had been a coup, gentlemen, if he had offered it to his wife, or to Clara, or simply left it alone, he would be alive. The poison would have been thrown out with the stale cakes. He killed himself. His greed pulled the trigger." Sylvia Blackwood made a small sound, a sharp intake of breath. She looked at the Major with her steely grey eyes, and for a moment there was something like gratitude in them. Then she looked away, toward the exit and her waiting taxi. "It's still murder, Major," Craddock said quietly. "Ingenious, perhaps, but murder." "I know," the Major said. He smoothed the lapels of his tweed jacket. "I'm not trying to escape, man. I did what was necessary. The village is cleaner now. The library is safe. Mrs. Blackwood is free." He turned to Miss Marple. "You always were sharp, Jane. I thought the wax paper would be gone with the wind. Careless of me." "You are a careful man, usually," Miss Marple said. "Your shoes, your cane." "Yes," the Major nodded. He looked down at his shoes, watching a drop of rain splash onto the polished leather. "I polished my medals this morning, you know, before I came out. Used the good beeswax and a soft cloth. I wanted to look my best. A soldier should always be prepared for his final inspection." He held out his hands to Craddock. There were no handcuffs. Craddock simply nodded toward the police car, waiting in the lane. "Shall we?" the Major asked. "After you, Major," Craddock said. The Major walked out into the rain. He didn't run. He didn't hunch his shoulders against the downpour. He walked with a steady, measured stride, his cane tapping a rhythm on the wet path. Click, click, click. The remaining group watched him go. "Well," said Mrs. McGillicuddy, breaking the silence. She picked up the silver platter and began to wipe it vigorously with a napkin. I suppose that's that, though it's a terrible waste of a good scone. Miss Marple stood up. She picked up her knitting bag. The storm was passing. The thunder was rumbling, further away toward the hills. It wasn't wasted, Elspeth, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. It served a purpose. It reminded us all that manners are not just empty rituals. Sometimes they are the only thing standing between us and— She paused, looking at the crushed hydrangeas where Rupert had fallen. And chaos, she finished. She opened her umbrella. Come along. I believe there is still some seed cake left, and I find myself quite hungry. Miss Marple stepped out of the tent, her sensible shoes splashing in the puddles, leaving the empty plate behind. A silver circle shining in the gloom, clean, bright, and waiting for the next tea. The end.